to another episode of the Forgotten Outdoors podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Today is actually going to be kind of a cool episode. We are covering I don't know what you call it, a fan question?
Yeah,
A listener question?
listener question.
Yes. So we're going to kind of dive into it a little bit from a couple different angles, but this was the main question. When stalking and tracking as a bow hunter, I know I need to get close enough to make an ethical shot. So how do you get within 40 yards? So, Ben, I guess what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, initial response to that question, I would say, is an ethical shot really depends on the work that you've done and what you're comfortable with. So this person, obviously, that's probably where they're comfortable, is at 40 yards with a bow. But that totally depends on your experience and how much you're practicing and what you feel confident with. And I think that can be spoken for any kind of hunting, whether it's archery, whether it's with a rifle.
With a spear?
Yeah, if you're that
Whatever.
cool. You need to be practicing enough that you know your limitations and you know what you're confident in. I think that so much of hunting and having success is making decisions with confidence in a very intense situation, because it is when you're putting the stock on an animal and it's go time, like your blood's going to be pumping, the adrenaline's going to be rushing, and you want to be 100% confident in your abilities. You don't want to be second guessing yourself in the moment. So if 40 yards is what you are comfortable with a bow, that's what you need to close the gap to. Mm-hmm. Some people are comfortable at farther distances than that. They're comfortable at 50 or 60 yards with a bow. Some people are less. If you're not comfortable at very far, 10, 15 yards, maybe you shouldn't be archery hunting yet. Honestly,
Yeah.
Maybe you need to practice more so that you are confident in making a good kill and a clean kill. So I think that before we even get into how to get that close on an animal, I think that it's important to mention that know your limitations, know what you are capable of doing, and then build that confidence in what you can accomplish.
Yeah.
Build that confidence. Say, I can smoke an animal at 40 yards. I can smoke an animal at 50 yards. With a rifle, I know that at 300 yards, anything within inside that animal is dead. And so if I'm up in the hills and I have a shot, that animal's at 275 yards, I'm taking that shot, and I know that animal's going to hit the ground. I think that's the level of confidence you need to be before you even are in a situation to make that shot.
Yeah, so I think, I guess just to kind of summarize that thought would be, as far as closing the gap to a certain distance, you need to find out what shot is ethical for you. Mm-hmm. So like me and Ben kind of talked about this before. I'm brand new to archery hunting. Ben has been doing it for a couple years now. So for me, I was telling Ben, I said, I think I would for sure shoot anything at 40 yards if conditions were pretty good, like very little wind or no wind. It's a pretty straight shot. The animal's not like going downhill or quartering away or whatever. And so for me, I was like 40 yards would be my max, and it would have to be good conditions. And I'm hoping to improve that this year. Like that's my main goal. I set for myself with archery hunting is I want to be comfortable up to 50, like 50 yards being my max, 40 yards being like, yeah, I'm for sure taking that shot. So I think you just need to determine what is ethical. Whoever this individual is that asked the question, they asked for 40 yards, but you need to find out if that's an ethical shot for you.
Yeah. And it's practice, guys. I don't know of many people who have just this God-given gift where, the first time they fling an arrow or shoot around down range, they're hitting bullseye after bullseye at a 60-yard shot. It just takes practice.
Yeah.
If you are only confident at 30 yards, you can increase that. You can.
Yeah.
you just gotta fling arrows down range, consistency. And yeah, you can widen your range of what you're going to be capable with, and you'll have better odds. You will. It's a lot easier to get within 60 yards of an animal than it is to get 30 yards of an animal or 20 yards of an animal.
Yeah, for sure. So I think just getting into the question a little bit farther. So like we said, first determine what your ethical shot is. And then as far as getting close, obviously that's going to differ from archery to rifle hunting. Kind of like what Ben said. Like I feel like for the most part, 300 yards seems to be the standard on rifle hunting.
Yeah.
It seems like most people try to at least get to that point. I would say that 300-yard shot for a rifle would be similar to like a 30 or 40-yard shot with a bow. Like if you're hunting with a rifle, chances are you're confident to that level. Not saying you have to be by any means. I'm not saying that. But I would say that that's kind of like the standard, and that's going to be different getting within 300 yards than getting within 30 yards.
Yeah, and I think some of that, now that we're speaking about rifles and the shots that people take, I think that 300 yards is kind of a standard because there's not going to be much ballistic change. There's not going to be a lot of bullet drop in most calibers at that range.
And not unless you're shooting a crazy heavy bullet.
Yeah, I mean, that's a generalization. It's not always the case, but I think a lot of popular hunting rounds, you're not going to see a whole lot of change in your bullet at 300 yards. There will be minimal change, of course, but not something that you really have to start compensating for. I mean, once you get past that, especially, I think, a big benchmark in long range shooting is 500 yards. Once you hit that kind of mark, you have to really be paying attention to what your bullet's doing. You have to know what your bullet's doing and how to compensate, or you're going to make bad shots.
And chances are you've either set some kind of a marker on your scope, or you have, the turret system where you can just twist a certain amount of clicks to get to that kind of a range.
Yeah.
So again, that comes down to just practice and getting familiar with your equipment to the point that you just sit down, you range it, and okay, I'm 500 yards, here we go. Like I just need to twist it, or I need to raise it this high, or whatever it is. As long as you're comfortable with it and it's ethical, then for us that seems to be the main thing. Is just as long as you're comfortable with it, then that's kind of a personal thing with if it's ethical or not.
Yeah, and technical shooting, long range shooting, is a very technical thing. It's something that you need to put a lot of work in and a lot of research and a lot of time into. So if what your resources is I'm going with my dad or my uncle and I'm borrowing their rifle, I wouldn't recommend those long shots.
Yeah.
Because it's something that does take time, and it does take, a lot of technical skill to be able to accurately, time after time, make long range shots. Thomas was talking about some of the turrets, those tactical turrets where you're adjusting your mills inside your reticle to compensate for windage, for elevation, and there's a lot of different factors that we're not going to go into in this episode that come into play when you're flinging a bolt that far. So just things to keep in mind. I think with this episode, we're going to go more into the archery hunting.
For sure. Yeah.
I mean, it's not as difficult to get within 300 yards of an animal. It's more, knowing the areas that you're going to be in.
Finding a good shooting lane.
Right, that kind of thing when it is rifle hunting. And terrain plays a big part in that. If you're in deep timber, you're not going to get those kind of shots. But focusing more on archery, we're getting stuck up on the rifle side of this, and that's not really what the question was asking. I think a lot of it depends on the animal that you're going to be hunting, terrain, and the style that you're hunting. I think early on in one of our episodes, we talked about the different styles of hunting, different tactics that people use to kind of close that distance on an animal. So within the archery world, just to rattle off a few off the top of my head, one that we have here in Idaho is elk hunting. It's in the rut with a bow, which means it's a breeding season. They are moving around a lot.
Activity.
Yeah, they're pissed off. They're looking for a mate.
Yes.
That they're
or
roaming
multiple.
They're roaming around. They're very active, and you are trying to locate these animals. A lot of those tactics is bugling, calling to elk. I'm sure many hunters have either tried this, or if you're getting into it, or at least aware that elk are very vocal, usually vocal at this time of year, and you're trying to locate that. You're trying to get into areas where there's high traffic of elk. You're trying to figure out where they're at by them being vocal, and then you're trying to communicate with them and either get a sneak on them, or you're trying to lure them in with your calls, with
Yeah.
you being vocal yourself, pretending that you're an elk, another bull, challenging them, or a cow, in estrus that needs to be bred.
Yeah, and I think some of the things that we talked about prior to starting the recording of this episode is we kind of talked about three major things that we felt play into closing the distance, especially with a bow, and those being wind or scent for the animal if they're going to smell you, the noise that you're making if you're closing the gap, and the third one was sight. So obviously if you're just like walking on the top of a hill and your silhouette is visible to the animals, then that would be
Skylining yourself.
yeah, skylining. That's the word I was looking for. That's gonna cause some issues for you trying to close the gap. But with Ben talking about the elk, I think during their breeding season, during the peak of the rut, I think that those bulls especially are on high alert because they're kind of trying to establish a boundary that's like their territory. And so I think if they're hearing, crunching leaves or whatever, then to them that's going to be, it could be another bull elk coming in to try to take over their herd. It could be, a predator, a predatorial animal coming in. Like you just don't know what it is. But I think during that peak rutting season seems to be when they're on high alert, trying to make sure that nobody messes with their cows and nobody's threatening, their herd.
Yeah, and being on high alert, it doesn't mean that they're going to be super skittish.
Right.
I think that's one of the times of year that they'll probably be the least skittish.
More aggressive.
But more aggressive. They're definitely going to be aware of what's kind of going around in their area. You brought up those three things, Tom. We talked about them earlier with scent, sight, and sound.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of three indicators that you need to be wary of that's going to flag you, that an animal might catch on to and bust you, and then you're going to ruin your opportunity. I think the most important one of these things to be wary of is scent. I think before anything else, that's what's going to bust an animal. An animal's going to bust you by smelling you. I think that's one of their best senses.
Right.
I think that if you are trying to archery hunt, you have to take in where the wind is if you're going to be successful.
Yeah, because
time after time.
And I think something that's interesting, and recently I watched the episode of The Meat Eater on Netflix. If you haven't watched those, you should check them out.
Yeah.
But they were hunting a bear, and something that's just kind of a dead giveaway that they're smelling something funky is it seems like any animal, but in this episode particularly, it was a bear. They'll start kind of waving their nose up in the air, just kind of like in the wind. They're just trying to figure out what's coming, what might be kind of funky or off in the wind. And so this episode that I was watching, this bear was like 600 plus yards away and still able to get a smell, and he took off. Like he knew something was off, didn't like it, and the bear just busted out of there. And so I do think that the winding and the scent that you're putting off is going to be the hardest one to control when trying to get within the 40-yard distance.
Yeah, and something that's probably overlooked more than anything. I think that as hunters, we naturally think that we need to camouflage. We don't want to be out in the open. It's sight, animals are going to see us because as humans, that's our primary warning sign. That's our primary indicator when we see danger. We're seeing danger.
Right.
That's one of our stronger senses. But that's the opposite with most big game animals. Is their noses work in a completely different way than human noses, and they can smell things incredibly. So, yeah, making sure that your wind is right. And so we've been talking about elk hunting. If you have a bugling bull in a certain area, make sure you know where your wind is and what it's doing before you try to put a stock on that animal. Or if you're sitting a wallow, a big mud hole where you think an elk's going to come in, try to figure out where that bull is going to come into and be sitting accordingly so that you are downwind of that wallow. it's going to ruin a hunt. It's ruined some of my hunts.
Yeah.
When the wind wasn't right, I either didn't take it into account, or the wind changes, and that happens sometimes, and it sucks. There's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, when the wind swirls.
Yeah, you get in some of those draws, and the wind just kind of circles around, and I've been busted by elk that way. So that's an important one with elk is figuring out where your wind is. But also other animals as well. We haven't really covered whitetail.
Right.
That's a very popular big game animal to hunt. Back east, it's huge. We have whitetail here in Idaho. We have a couple of them hanging on the wall. We love whitetail hunting. I
Yeah.
love sitting tree stands. And so that's a little bit harder because you do have to take into account where the wind's going to be, where your deer are traveling on a path, and what the wind typically does. When you're whitetail hunting, you still are trying to take it into account that way. But sometimes it's out of your hands. You are elevated, which does help. It does help with the sight aspect and moving. It does help with, the hearing, you're not on their level. But I think that it needs to be at least addressed that when you're whitetail hunting out of a stand, there are some scent blockers and some things that I think help.
Right.
I don't get crazy with it. I know that there's a million different products out there, and people get really into it, but at least washing your hunting clothes in non-scented soap.
Right.
They have some field sprays that just kind of deaden some of that scent. I feel like personally it has helped make some of my hunts successful, just taking that little bit of edge off. Because, sometimes you're sitting in a clearing, in a tree stand, and that wind does just kind of that little swirl. It's not moving around much, and I've been busted quite a few times by whitetail doing that. So I think that it does play into effect that way. Elk, I don't know if it plays as much a role using some of those scent blockers as it does whitetail. But
at that point, you're playing more with the wind than with the scent. And I think, I think Ben bringing up whitetail hunting, it brings up a whole new point, but a good point of, there's going to be multiple ways to close that distance. One of those being tree stands. If you get up into a tree stand and you just are in a high traffic area, at that point, you're just kind of betting that the animals will be coming close to you, coming within your 40-yard range. And I think also Ben talking about the wallows and things for elk. There's opportunities for you to set up prior to the animals being there. That will get you within the 40 yards. And so I think
much easier.
Yeah. And I think that's something to think about. Is if you're trying to close the gap, sometimes the best way to do that is just to already be at the distance you're comfortable.
Stationary. Yeah.
And then just wait for the animal to come to you. However, I imagine that the individual asking the question was more wondering, if I see an elk, how do I close the gap? And at that point, I think you being aware of your surroundings, aware of the wind, aware of if you've been sweating profusely, because, if you're sweating, if you're putting off a lot of smell, then at that point it becomes even more important for you to
play the wind
and make sure that you're going to stay out of those, out of the animal's nose. And so I think, you just got, if you're stalking the animal and you're trying to close the distance, it really comes down to wind. Obviously trying to keep keep from skylining, keep from being seen. And then, you hear sometimes people will take their boots off to, be walking in socks to make their stalk quieter. And so, I guess that we can maybe get into that a little bit, getting into like more of like the tips and tricks to be quiet and tips and tricks to, close that distance that way. But I would say that you kind of have two methods to close the gap. One is to be stationary waiting for the animal, and the other to be just very aware of the wind and how much, be aware of the ground that you're walking on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're going to have a little bit better odds at closing to a closer distance when you are stationary. Obviously you're not moving. You're less likely to be flagged by an animal that way. It does take a little bit more homework to be successful there. You need to know where to be set up so that you are going to have those opportunities where animals are going right in front of you. So big one with elk, we've mentioned it, is wallows, a big mud hole where during that rut season, bulls are going to want to get in there, flip mud around, get all nasty, dirty. It's a weird thing, but they just are attracted to it like crazy. So wallows are a big thing. Water holes are another big thing with a lot of different game animals. And then whitetail. Whitetail, it takes a lot of figuring out what game trails the good bucks are moving on.
And I think part of that comes from just doing homework preseason with trail cameras.
Yeah.
And in some places you're able to put out feeders for deer. In Idaho you can't, but in some places, that might be a way to do it, is just kind of train the animals. But yeah, I think that I think that it comes down to just doing your homework, making sure that you're in the right place at the right time.
Yeah. So I mean, I always recommend that approach of the stationary, trying to be patient, and it's a patience game. You're going to be very, very bored of sitting, in a singular location trying to wait for an animal to come that might never come. So it is a patience game, but also, for instance, you might be sitting a wallow and bulls might be screaming on another ridge, and you try to call them in and they don't want anything to do with you, but they're still talking. They're over there. It might be a good opportunity to try to put a stalk on something.
Yeah.
So that approach, I'm definitely going to go after those bulls. I'm not just going to wait all night at a wallow that they might never come to.
Yeah.
If I don't know they're hitting it very hard. But if they're talking somewhere, then let's do the other approach. Let's try to get a stalk. Let's figure out where we think that bull's located. Let's figure out what the wind's doing and what the terrain's doing as well. What kind of cover am I going to have? What kind of foliage or plants am I going to be walking through? How noisy is that going to be?
Yeah.
Has it rained recently? Is a lot of those weeds and little sticks that you're going to be walking on, is it super dry? Am I going to be crunching on every single footstep? Is there a game trail that's a little bit more clear that I can walk down? Or is it drizzling outside and I don't really need to worry about the sound as much, and I can take a more direct, more rapid approach towards that animal? So these are all things that take an effect. And another thing that I don't want to forget, so I'm going to say it now, is with sight. It still needs to be taken into effect. I think it's one of the least likely indicators to flag you.
Or at least the last.
Yeah, one of the last. Because you have to be pretty close. But I don't think they pick up sight as well as we think that they might, but I think they pick up movement very well. So very gradual, very steady movement is less likely to flag an animal than quick, jerky movements, even if we think that we're hiding behind a tree or something like that. Very gradual, especially I found that with whitetail. Yeah. Man, you make any sort of a quick head turn and they've got you. Ooh, that brings up a story. You want to tell about your first time sitting at a bear stand with me, Tom?
Freaking bear. Yeah, so me and Ben, we were sitting... we were in two different tree stands over a bear bait, and it was my first time sitting tree stand. I mean, the very first time.
And it's kind of spooky.
It's a little spooky, especially with hunting bears. I mean,
we had some big bears coming in too.
Yeah, we had set up some trail cameras. We knew bears were there, and so this was my first bear hunt, first tree stand. So like a couple of firsts for me for sure. And Ben had even told me. He'd even warned me beforehand. He was like, okay, when we get in there, you just kind of have to be slow. You have to be slow in your movements. Try not to do anything that's super sudden. But once you're there and you're sitting there and it's dead quiet, every noise was making me like jerk. If I heard a squirrel, I'd turn and look. And sure enough, I hear something coming up behind me, and I'm trying to be good. I'm actually doing pretty good at sitting still for a while. And then it seems like it's pretty close, so I did a quick head swivel to my left, and right as I did that, all I could see was the bear running away from us.
Yeah.
And it was totally my fault. And it was because I had made that sudden movement of just wanting to look to see what was coming, and that's all it was. It was just curiosity, and it ruined the opportunity.
Yeah, and it's just human nature.
Yeah.
If you're walking down the hall at school or something like that, and somebody shouts your name, you flip around. It's your natural.
Or just hear a loud noise.
Yeah, it's your natural human response, especially when you're waiting and you're honing into all of your senses to try to kill an animal, and you hear something. Automatically, you're thinking animal, I
Right.
need to prepare myself for what's about to happen. But I think the best thing is to not even look.
Just wait.
If you're sitting a bait like that, or you're sitting a trail for whitetail, and just wait until they come in front of you.
Yeah.
And if you do look, it's just painfully slow motion, turning around, because that is one of those indicators, is that fast movement they pick up on. Whereas the gradual movement, and we're wearing camouflage, I don't think that they flack it as much. I've had animals kind of look right at me, even when I wasn't in camouflage, without moving, and they just kind of keep going on. They don't really mind it as much. Not every time, but as much.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to go back to kind of touch on something that you brought up with the ground coverage. So we had an experience this past season. We were in unknown territory, and we kind of got on this game trail for a while. Then the game trail started getting really thick.
Yeah.
Then it started getting nasty. I think we talked about this before, but we ended up making a ton of noise.
Yeah.
And so going back to like Ben's example of, if you're sitting on a wallow, you hear elk bugling a ridge over, and you start kind of hiking into them. Well, you don't want to go hiking into them and then make a bunch of noise and then blow them out. Sometimes it might be the better approach to go back to camp, wait till the next day, wake up early, get in a good spot before, the sun comes up. And then again, you're kind of stationary, but you're in the right area. Because the problem we had is when we went and we made all that noise, we basically had ruined the hunting area for at least the day, if not for the rest of the week. Just because we made so much noise that there's no way any animals were sticking around. Whereas if we had just maybe been like, we don't really know the area, let's take a break, we maybe could have come back the next day or that night, and maybe would have had some success there. And so as far as ground coverage goes, if you're going to be making a bunch of noise, it might be worth holding back to avoid blowing out the entire area.
Yeah. Or if you know that you have to make some noise, do it tactfully. Do it with a purpose in mind, especially with elk, because it's a tactic bringing elk in to make a lot of noise. But you have to do it right. You have to sound like an elk.
Yeah.
You have to be bugling. You have to make those sounds of a bull rutting around and
Scraping on trees,
breaking branches and raking the brush. So that's a tactic that I've used when I'm like, yeah, I just kind of made a lot of noise, but let's not make it sound like human hiking noise. Let's make it sound like a bull thrashing around, and hopefully we deceive them. I don't know if it works every time, but it's an arrow in your quiver to try to further deceive the animal to close that distance on them. Yeah, just trying to get in the mind of an elk. But yeah, a lot of things to consider when you're trying to close that gap. I think the easiest one is to be stationary, and then
be waiting for them.
Yeah. And then when you are trying to get a stock on something, I think first and foremost is the scent. Where's your wind? Your wind? What's your wind doing? What's the terrain doing? How much noise am I going to make getting to a certain area? And then the site, what kind of movements am I going to do? Do I have cover behind brush or trees?
Do I need to get on my hands and knees and crawl?
Yeah, because you did that last year.
I did that with my elk, yeah.
Yeah, where you had some terrain behind some sagebrush and kind of some hills where you like belly crawled it for like an hour to get a stock on an elk.
And it was because the sagebrush wasn't real tall. Mm-hmm. And if I had stood up, then it would have been, skylined. I would have been totally skylined. Mm-hmm. And so, that was a crazy stock. But I mean, it turned into a successful hunt, but it required very slow. I mean, kind of painfully slow. And I was army crawling for half the distance at least. Yeah. And then I got to a point where I was behind some rocks, and so I mean,
how long do you think that you put that stock on from when you're like, there's an elk, to pulling the trigger and killing that bull?
Yeah, I think on that one, and I might have to reference my boy Sam because he was with me, but we saw it midday, so probably 11 or 12, and I bet I was pulling the trigger about 4.
Yeah.
So 4 or 5 hours on a stock of, I think it was about 1,000 yards. So, I mean, we weren't close, but 1,000 yards. And I was just trying, I was hunting with a rifle. So I was really just trying to get within at least 200, 300 yards. but the terrain was pretty, bumpy. And it got to a point where I had lost sight of the elk. And so then that caused a new dilemma.
Yeah.
Where I didn't want to just pop up. And so I was very, very slow. And then I eventually closed the gap to almost 70 yards maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just slow and patient. And that's all it was.
Yeah, stupid slow.
Yeah.
Yeah, some stalks, especially if you're trying to like put a stalk on something with a bow, it can take hours to cover like 100 yards, 200 yards.
Because the other thing with elk during their rut is they're usually in a big old herd.
Yeah.
And so you have a lot of eyes to be worried about. You have a lot of noses to be worried about.
A lot of ears.
Yeah. And so for me, that was new experience for me, seeing that many elk. And then when I actually popped up over the edge of this little rock formation, when I popped up, one of the cow elk saw me. And it's kind of like what Ben said, that sudden movement, my head came up. And then her head popped up and she stood up. And at that point, I knew I was busted from her. And so I just had to get up, get in a shooting position, calm myself down, find the bull I was looking for, and then pull the trigger. And it ended up being successful. But, had I not been ready to take that shot quick, they probably would have busted me and been hauling out of there. So
yeah, it takes hours of this, preparation and crawling for like a split second where you can't screw it up. And even before that, it takes like weeks. How many times did we drive out there and hours and days did you spend looking for them? And it all comes down to one moment of making a good shot and making a quick shot.
Well, yeah. And I would say that's the other thing to, I guess, consider is if you're closing the distance, you better make sure that you're able to get your heart rate down, get your nerves under control, to hold steady with that bow, because that's something that's been new to me is, if we go out and we practice shooting for a long time, I get to a point where I start to get a little bit tired. And so I get shaky, and I feel like that can only be 10 times worse when you've got a ton of adrenaline pumping through you and you're all excited. I imagine that shaking gets worse. And so I think that would be the other thing to think about when you do close the distance is, taking the time to take a couple deep breaths, get set up on a good shot before letting go of an arrow.
Yeah. And sometimes it works out where you have the time and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And if you are completely shaky and freaking out, then don't take the shot if you're not confident in it. But I mean, some people practice with that, they'll do some sprints or some push-ups, or, they'll do some kind of physical exertion where they're getting that heart rate up, they're breathing hard, and then they shoot their bow to kind of practice those scenarios. I've done that, or you shoot in different kind of kneeling positions, sitting positions, just trying to replicate what you would actually be experiencing when the shot counts the most. So just kind of comes down to that confidence and what you're confident in doing, practicing. I think we're kind of coming to the end of this episode, but just kind of wrapping it up for, again, is trying to close on that animal. If you're going to be stationary, you're probably going to have a little bit better luck at getting close on some animals. Takes a little bit more homework. If you're going to try to put a stock, make sure that you're considering the smell, the sound, and the sight that you're going to be giving off so that animal doesn't wind you.
Yeah, and I guess just one more plug for an ethical shot. I think, a 30-yard shot might be ethical today, but if tomorrow you put a big long stock on an animal and you're shaky, it might not be ethical tomorrow. So, the ethical shot is a day by day, and it just depends on how much time you put into practice and how much comfort you have with your equipment.
Yeah. And I think that's going to wrap it up, guys. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Forgotten Outdoors podcast. As always, subscribe, like our Instagram, our Facebook page, get on our website. Give us a follow that ways, guys. We enjoy doing this. This episode came from a question from one of our listeners. We really appreciate it. Hopefully this helped out. And if you guys have any questions, definitely hit us up. We'll try to get it on our episode or at least address it directly or through social media. And as always, stay safe out there, guys, and take it easy.
Okay, we'll see you.